I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, I want to make two preliminary comments, and the first is to acknowledge the Minister's admission that this measure is only one small step, important in itself, but one small step, and that much more is needed. We totally agree, and that's the approach that all of the other parties in the House are taking, of course. In that light, I would also like to endorse Megan Wood's call for a cross-party approach to development of a strategy for some real actions on climate change. And I think James Shaw has just echoed that sentiment in his speech. We all want to move as fast as we possibly can to tackle this most serious of all problems facing humankind. But my endorsement of that approach is subject to a caveat, and that caveat is simply that we all need to listen to each other. So Labor and the Greens need to listen to the other parties who may not necessarily agree with every aspect of their argument. And we need to listen to each other so that we can gain some degree of consensus so that those real actions that we want to see actually happen. Now, in following on from that, I want to make this perfectly clear. New Zealand First does want a more cautious approach to agricultural emissions than the Labor and Green parties have taken. And while agricultural emissions are very significant for New Zealand and must not be left out of any future strategy to reduce our emissions profile overall, we cannot move too far ahead of competing agricultural exporting countries simply because we would become uncompetitive, we're likely to become uncompetitive, and that would be a problem. And the damage to our farming community and exports simply could not bear some of the measures that some are wanting to take very quickly. So I would ask Labor and the Greens to acknowledge that, and to also acknowledge that, as a matter of fact, the European Union, which is the world's largest agricultural producer by far, has no primary food production commitment as far as emissions are concerned at all. Think about that. And neither, by the way, has another huge producer, the United States of America. And the truth is that New Zealand farmers are already the most carbon efficient on earth, already some way ahead. So bearing that in mind, while we do want progress as far as agricultural emissions are concerned, we cannot push that envelope too far without doing too much damage. And as a matter of fact, until the European Union and the United States of America start to move too, then neither should we stick our neck out too far. And I note in that context that James Shaw was content to follow. He said that in one of his speeches. As long as we do something, as long as we make progress, we should be content to follow. So that's the approach I think we should be taking as far as agricultural emissions are concerned. And I'd like to point this out, Mr Speaker, too, that the Observer published an article only last Sunday on the front page, and the headline was, quote, "Eat New Zealand lamb and save the world," unquote. And that shows that they understand that New Zealand agriculture, as far as carbon is concerned, as far as emissions are concerned, lead the world. And that reinforces what I've been saying. Yes, we do need to make progress with agricultural emissions, and yes, it does have to be a major part of the strategy that we're calling for, and yes, we do need to try and develop a consensus amongst the parties to take actions as part of that strategy. The other parties, Labor and the Greens, need to listen to us, and I think to the National Party, who seem to be saying roughly the same thing, that as far as agricultural emissions are concerned, we actually need to be a little bit realistic. That doesn't mean a lack of commitment, it just means a degree of realism. In any event, if we follow New Zealand First's prescription, we don't really need to move too fast on agriculture, because it would form part of what we want to see as the first area where we would take actions, and that would be the whole area of transport. And we want to see transport targeted early. and actively and effectively. We want to see electric cars encouraged. We want to see electric buses and trucks, which are now under development, being incentivised. We want to see the main trunk railway in New Zealand completely electrified. We want to see that light rail is introduced with government assistance into the main centres and to encourage, in fact, all public transport. We want to see that the New Zealand railway system is completely redeveloped so that it would become a modern and efficient and effective system and would thereby make a major contribution to reducing our dependence in this country on fossil fuels. So that's the priority for us, but as I have said, Mr. Speaker, we do need to develop a consensus. That does mean all parties listening to each other and listening to what I hope I've been saying, and we'll certainly be listening to what others are saying as well, with the possible exception of David Seymour, who is unlikely to make any contribution whatsoever. However, having said that, we will nevertheless try to work with other parties, and we do want to see a comprehensive strategy developed. This is one very minor first step, not enough in itself, and I agree with the Minister, a lot more needs to be done, so let's get on with it.